In the Old Testament, Jacob is said to have wrestled with God. I've certainly wrestled. In the Old Testament, Jacob is said to have wrestled with God. I've certainly wrestled over the thoughts in these two talks. It's a two-part talk. And I've wrestled as to whether or not to present these thoughts. But it looks like we're going to do it. I do want to mention this, though. The real point of this talk will not be evident until almost the very end of tomorrow's discourse, part 2. It's going to seem to be about one thing, but it's really about something else. So if you could hang in there till the end of tomorrow's talk. Anyway, starting out with a question. In less than 2 years, we're going to be celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the end of the Gentile times and the smiting of the image of the kingdoms of this world. Many sincerely believe we're 138 years now into the millennium and God's kingdom and the times of restitution. Many are present at this convention who can remember a time when they could not have dreamed that we would reach the year 2012. Is anyone concerned about this? Does it produce any doubt? Well, over 50 years ago, those who dared to express doubt about our chronological conclusions were met with strong opposition, and we experienced the largest division in modern Bible student history. Now, the Bible condemns divisions like these. In fact, in Galatians 5:19-21, Paul gives us a list of what he calls the works of the flesh. And he says, they who do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Here's some of the things on that list. This is from the Diaglott, Galatians 5:20. Enmities, quarrels, resentments, altercations, factions, that's divisions, sects, that's another word for divisions. Here's part of the list from the Living Bible. Hatred and fighting, complaints and criticisms, the feeling that everybody else is wrong except those in our own little group. Let's keep it real. Nothing characterizes the last 50 or more years among us than animosity and division over dates. By the way, Jesus could not have been more emphatic in warning us against setting dates. Now, brethren, if a relative or a friend were going to leave you for a long time, wouldn't you expect their last words to you would be of particular importance? Let's look at the last words of Jesus to his apostles. It's an answer to this question from the apostles. Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Acts 1:6 RSV. Dates. And here's his answer. It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority. Verse 7 NIV. Can we imagine all the trouble we could have avoided if we just listened to Jesus? You know that wonderful paragraph in the first volume which begins, close your eyes for a moment? Well, brethren, close your eyes for a moment and imagine a truth movement where there are no arguments or divisions over dates, where all the brethren dwell in harmony, meeting together, studying the Bible without any arguing over chronology or imagined dates for the time of our Lord's reign or restitution. Just a united effort to preach the gospel together. And that's what Jesus recommended. He went on to say in verse 8, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and unto the uttermost parts of the earth. So the last thing Jesus said was, do not even attempt to come up with dates that are in God's own authority. Instead, get busy being my witnesses throughout the world. And then he left. Last thing Jesus said, and almost nobody has listened to him. An unending list of prognosticators throughout history have used the 6,000 years, 6-day theory to prove a variety of different dates for our Lord's return and doomsday. Hippolytus believed Christ would return 6,000 years from Adam's creation. He believed, along with other prominent Christians of his day, that the 6,000 years would end in 500 AD. The Spanish monk Beatus, he predicted 800 AD on the same basis. Throughout Europe during the 900s, the belief was that the year 1000 would see the end of the world. Christopher Columbus predicted 1656 would be the date. He could discover America, but he couldn't discover the date for the kingdom. Puritan Cotton Mather preached 1697 would be the year for the world's end. He later changed that prediction to 1716. When that date came and went, 1736 became his new deadline for Christ's return. His motto must have been, if at first you don't succeed, try again. William Miller had a variety of dates fail, all of them in the neighborhood of 1843 to 1844. The Bible students set 1914 as their date. When that didn't work out, the 7th volume was published with a new date. They added 3 years to the parallels and determined the spring of 1918 would see great things. And on page 62, they added yet another date, quoting, "It is possible that AD 1980 marks the regathering of all fleshly Israel from their captivity in death." Their proof for this, continuing to quote, "It is just 70 years beyond 1910, the date when Pastor Russell gave his great witness to the Jewish people in the New York Hippodrome." So the whole Jewish race was to be resurrected by 1980. Keep in mind, in those days, and I think Brother Furnetz knows this, you had to accept the 7th volume or you were disfellowshipped. Just last year, family radio owner Harold Camping guaranteed Judgment Day would arrive on May 21, 2011. Didn't happen, so he moved it to October 21. Still no luck. The most imminent date we now have to look forward to is December 21, 2012. That's the last recorded day of the ancient Mayan calendar. These primitives may not have been able to invent the wheel, but they did manage to come up with a date for the end of the world. Well, why not? Everybody else has. Every predictor of dates has been 100% successful at being completely wrong. And our little list today of attempts are not even the tip of the iceberg. Nor do we have time to detail the ruined lives and faith provoked by these efforts to come up with a date. One example, though, is the Shakers. They became popular around 1774. They believed Christ had already returned. They banned procreation among their members. This meant no new generation of believers. But they felt there was no need to reproduce since the world would end in 1792. World didn't end, but they sure did. And here's a humorous story about one of William Miller's followers who on the day for the rapture glued turkey wings on himself, got up in a tree, to make the transport easier. He fell out of the tree and broke his leg. A less humorous result of this disease of date setting is mentioned in the book End Time Visions by Richard Abanus, page 219, referring to the Miller movement. As the terminal date of history drew closer, Adventists became increasingly divisive and antagonistic toward fellow Christians who would not join their movement. Brethren, one of the evils date setting produces is division, antagonism toward those who do not share your date. It is in the nature of date setting to reject, judge, and consider as unworthy those who don't share your date. As evidence of this, just look among ourselves. What do we think happened to anyone back in the day if they didn't accept 1914 as the date for the completion of the church? What has happened in our own day to those who won't accept 1874 as the beginning of the reign of Christ and the millennium? Or what has happened to those who believe 1874 did begin the millennium? Let's not think antagonism doesn't go both ways. At General Convention, they often have a service where two sides of a question are debated. A few years ago, they debated whether or not the image had been smitten in 1914. The committee couldn't find anyone, evidently, who would dare take the contrary position. So poor Bob Gorecki had to pretend to, while making sure he reminded the brethren he didn't really believe what he was saying. Now that spoke volumes as to our generosity toward the slightest disagreement with our prophetic date package. Or imagine this. What would happen to the brother who does not accept 1874 as the date of Christ's return? I mean, that's worse than not believing the millennium has started. Now, is it possible that Jesus ever addressed or warned against this fiasco of date setting and its consequences? Yes, he did. At great length in several parables and in plain statements. First to Jesus' plain statements. Just as they did before he left, the apostles asked Jesus for a date in Matthew 24:3. They said, "Tell us when these things shall be." And he did address that request at length from Matthew 24:32 through Matthew 25:30. Footnote. One of the great impediments to Bible study is the dividing up of God's Word into chapters and verses. It serves to isolate thoughts from their context. Jesus' answer to the apostles' question in Matthew 24:3 goes all the way through to the end of chapter 25. There should be no chapter division. Anyway, here's what Jesus said to their request for a date. "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Matthew 24:36. Same exact thing he said in Acts, but here's more. "Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come." Matthew 24:42. "Be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh." Matthew 24:44. "Watch therefore, for ye know neither the day nor the hour." Matthew 25:13. "But of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels who are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father." Mark 13:32. "Take heed, watch and pray, for ye know not when the time is." Mark 13:33. "Watch therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh." Mark 13:35. "The Son of Man cometh at an hour ye think not." Luke 12:40. And then Jesus' last words from Acts, it's not for you to know the times or dates the Father set by his own authority. Over and over and over again, Jesus said, watch. He never said calculate. He said, watch. Now, why did he say watch? Because there was no way to determine a date. Date setting and watching are mutually exclusive. That's why he said he comes as a thief. Since when does a thief give out the time of his arrival? Luke 12:39, today's English. If the man of the house knew the time the thief would come, if it was so easy, brethren, to come up with a date as just adding up 6,000 years, as so many during the age tried, why would Jesus say he didn't know the date or the angels? Are you telling me Jesus can't add up to 6,000? That 6 days of 6,000 year theory is not unique to us. Jewish rabbis and Christian leaders from the first century on promoted that concept and came up with a huge variety of dates, including 500 AD. Jesuit thinker Petavius in the 17th century predicted 2017 on that basis. Martin Luther, he predicted 2040. We could go on and on. Jesus could have measured the time from the beginning of the supposed Jewish age and paralleled it and come up with 1874 if that theory held any water at all. Jesus could have multiplied 50 times 50 and begun a count from when Israel observed their last Jubilee, because he would know when, if nobody else did. And so could the angels. Brethren, Jesus and the angels could have easily done any of the things William Miller and so many others have used to come up with their bogus dates. But Jesus said he didn't know. And he said the angels didn't know, and he said no man knows. Jesus told a story to illustrate the importance of listening to him about not trying to set a date for his return. It's a story about 10 virgins. 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. Now we want to find out what it was exactly that made the foolish foolish. What characterized them? For therein lies the lesson and the answer as to whether or not we are wise or foolish virgins. Now this story is unfortunately cordoned off from Jesus' answer to the apostles about dates by a totally arbitrary chapter division. And you know, maybe you can, but I can't remember an explanation of this parable that took into account what Jesus said the actual moral of this story was. Because Jesus actually interprets the meaning of this parable for us. Once it's all done, he sums up its lesson, its meaning, the reason he told the story in the first place, what it illustrates. This is in Matthew 25:13. You could look it up yourself. Right after the story, he says, watch, therefore. Therefore what? Because of the story he just told. For ye know neither the day nor the hour. The parable of the virgins is all about not knowing the day or the hour. It's about not setting dates and the necessity to watch, not calculate. Now let's see, with Jesus' explanation in mind, how that story beautifully makes that point. Matthew 25:1. Then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins, who took their lamps, went forth to meet the bridegroom. 5 were wise, 5 were foolish. They that were foolish took their lamps, and took no oil with them. Now, brethren, there we find defined by Jesus what made them foolish. They took no extra oil with them. They only had the oil that was already in their lamps. Now I ask you, why did they take no extra oil? And why did that make them foolish? Continuing. But the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. Verse 4. Why did taking extra oil make those virgins wise? Let's go forward to verse 8. Now this is after the bridegroom did not come as soon as expected. And the foolish said unto the wise, Give us of your oil, for our lamps are gone out. Now, brethren, perhaps we can relate to this best by thinking of the times we've run out of gas. There we are, stuck by the side of the road. We were foolish. We didn't have enough gas in our tank to get where we were going. Now, why did the foolish bring so little oil? And why did the wise bring an extra supply? And how does this illustrate what Jesus said is the point of the story? You know neither the day nor the hour. Very simple. The foolish thought they knew for sure when the bridegroom was going to come. So they brought only enough oil for that amount of time. They were date calculators, and they acted in accordance with a calculated date. The wise, on the other hand, they admitted to themselves they really had no way of knowing when the bridegroom would show up, so they brought enough oil to light their way for the whole night. And sure enough, the bridegroom took more time getting there than expected by the foolish, and so when it came time for the procession, the foolish had to go looking for more oil, while the wise were able to light the way for the procession. What made the foolish foolish was thinking they could know something they couldn't know. The exact arrival time of the bridegroom. They became the victims of their premature expectations. Have we ever been the victims of our premature expectations? The foolish virgins gambled their participation in the wedding on their guess as to when the bridegroom would arrive, on their ability to know what they couldn't know. They were sure something was going to happen before it really happened. And they were shut out of the wedding, and the bridegroom was so annoyed at their tardiness, he said, I don't even know you. They paid a very stiff price for thinking they knew something they couldn't know. By thinking the bridegroom would arrive soon, they wound up late. And that is why Jesus said at the end of the story, Watch therefore, for ye know neither the day nor the hour. In other words, be a wise virgin. Don't think you can know something you can't know. To be foolish, according to Jesus, is to think that at a certain time something's going to happen when you can't be sure. To be a foolish virgin is to have premature expectations. To be convinced you can know something Jesus said you can't. To be a date setter. The parable is sometimes associated with the Miller movement, as if that's the only time in history a group has had premature expectations. But they certainly were an example of foolish virgin thinking. Miller devised a series of time proofs that the Lord would return between 1843 and 1844. Even though that was something Jesus said over and over again, you can't do it. Now let's look at these proofs for a moment, because it is actually through the Miller movement, with just a few minor adjustments, that we have wound up with our own set of premature expectations. Now much of this is from Second Advent Tract number 5 by William Miller, printed in the year 1840. Miller began the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 at 457 BC. He also began the 2300 days of Daniel 8:14 on that date. That brought him to 1843. He also subscribed to the 6,000-year theory, which his chronology also took him to 1843. Not stopping there, he used the Jubilee cycles. They took him to 1843. The 7 times of punishment upon Israel, 2,520 years, what we call the Gentile times, also came out, according to William Miller, 1843. He started it in 677 BC. We started in 606. And he began the 1335 days of Daniel in AD 508. Again, 1843 on the nose. All of these time calculations, all ending at the same date, convinced a lot of folks that William Miller was right and Jesus was wrong about not being able to set a date. But Jesus is never wrong. That's my favorite line in the 2 days of talks. Jesus is never wrong. And so, as convincing as all this evidence was, the Millerites met with disaster. After March 21, 1843 passed uneventfully, the general public began to deride the Millerites, but they remained unfazed. They extended the time to March 21, 1844. When that date failed, they tried again. October 22, 1844, another failure. The emotional pain was overwhelming for thousands of faithful believers. Joseph Bates, a close associate of Miller's, wrote a friend the following day, quote, "You have no idea the feeling that seized me. If the earth could have opened up and swallowed me up, it would have been sweetness compared to the distress I felt." But now here's a little known fact that reveals the lengths some folks will go to hold on to a premature expectation, even when it is clearly demonstrated they are wrong. This is from page 265 of A Brief History of William Miller, published by Advent Christian Publication Society in 1910. Quoting from page 265. To be consistent, those who ascribed that movement entirely to the Lord had to consider that some event in connection with the fulfillment of prophecy did transpire at that time. And as they had taught that Christ would then come, they conceived the idea that he came invisibly and closed the door of mercy to the sinner, illustrating it by the parable of the bridegroom's coming and shutting the door, after which the foolish virgins sought admittance in vain. Thus they contended that the work of preaching the gospel was ended. Does that ring any bells? Isn't it ironic, though, that they took a parable which Jesus said illustrated you can't know the date. They took that parable to justify their having set the date. And when it didn't pan out, insisting it did anyway, just invisibly, and now all sinners have to suffer because the door is closed. Brethren, are we perhaps seeing why Jesus would so often warn against trying to set the date for his return? And this was not to be the last time false calculations were to result in the closing of the door of salvation. There are groups to this day that claim their beginnings back to Bible student history who still insist the door is closed on the basis of chronology. The Jehovah's Witnesses, the most notable among them, in Kingdom Halls, they set up memorial emblems in a mock ceremony that they allow no one to participate in because the door's closed chronologically. Among the Millerites, huge arguments arose. There was now a division among them between the shut door, invisible presence, brethren, and those who admitted a mistake had been made. Miller himself was humble enough to be of the latter group. Page 270 of the Miller History book. Quote, "Brotherly love gave place to contention and disputation, and the cause had to bear the reproach of those who had thus departed from the position occupied by Mr. Miller and the body." There we have it. Premature expectations, foolish virgin thinking, believing we can know something Jesus said we can't, followed by the inevitable dispute, contention, division. Does that sound familiar? Premature expectations leading to division. Brethren, of what good is all the knowledge in the world if it leads to the loss of brotherly love among us? Premature expectations. Foolish virgin thinking. We know when the time is. No chance of our being wrong. So why bring extra oil for the night? Because we're certain. We know when the bridegroom's coming. I mean, at least the foolish virgins of Jesus' story, when the bridegroom didn't arrive on their timetable, didn't pretend he'd already come and was invisible to save face. They admitted they were wrong. They went off to get some extra oil. Some of those Millerites wouldn't admit they were wrong. They insisted their date was right. It's just Jesus did come. We just didn't see him. You know, brethren, if the fulfillment of a time prophecy is invisible, well, you can prove anything in the world at any time. Are we wise or foolish virgins? Our Jubilee calculations were stretched to come out to 1874. Restitution supposed to start, Christ's 1,000-year reign, binding of Satan, God's kingdom. Now we are 138 years from that date, and we still hold on to our premature expectations in spite of all evidence to the contrary. And like the Millerites who insisted their timing was right and closed the door to preserve their predictions, brethren, what does God have to do to get our attention? The bane of the Bible student movement has been our insistence to hold on to dates that were arrived at in direct contradiction to Jesus' constant warnings and stories that it is not given to us to know the day or the hour. We have lost friends, family, and brethren over a 50-year argument as to whether or not the millennium and restitution started in 1874 as a group of Adventists predicted. That's right, brethren, Adventists. The same folks, the same crew who missed on 3 separate dates between March 1843 and October 1844, they are the ones who came up with the 1874 date. It was not Brother Russell who came up with those false expectations, and he never claimed to. He was talked into them by these Adventists. Page 227, End Time Visions, again, quote, "A lesser-known faction retained the name Second Adventists. They continued to speculate about the timing of Christ's return. They actually set another date for Jesus' second coming, 1873, 1874. As unbelievable as it sounds, a second doomsday movement was born. It too drew hundreds of followers, including one young man by the name of Charles Taze Russell." And Brother Russell confirms this. Reprint 88. I'm quoting but condensing for time's sake. Brother Russell, quote, "The cry that the bridegroom was due to be here in 1874 was made first among the Second Advent denomination. The writer," it's Brother Russell, "the writer was sound asleep in profound ignorance of the cry until 1876. Brother Russell again confirms this. Reprint 188, looking back, quoting, "Looking back to 1871, many of our company were Second Adventists. They claimed the Second Advent would occur in 1873 because the 6,000 years from the creation of Adam would be complete then. Well, 1873 came and no burning of the world and so on. But prophecies were found which pointed positively to the autumn of 1874. That time came and the earth rolled on as ever." And then Brother Russell goes on to say, look it up for yourself, that everyone was mystified because all their proofs, recalculated from Miller's original ideas, seemed so perfect. And then Brother Russell says that a Brother Keith was reading the Diaglott, and he came up with the same idea that the Adventists had invented 30 years earlier. Their date was right. Their expectations were wrong. Jesus had returned invisibly. History repeated itself. 1914 was now the new date for the end of the world and the church all taken to heaven. When Brother Russell died, the new leaders made date setting their mantra to keep followers enthused and controlled. They set 1925. Russell Pollock was out on the road preaching, millions now living shall never die. That was their 1925 theme song. Eventually, they declared the kingdom is here. Anyone not accepting their message goes into second death. They later tried 1975 on the basis of recalculating the 6,000 years. Many were drummed out who wouldn't accept those new ideas, and they regathered later through the dawn in the 1930s. God bless the dawn for that. And for a time, with the dawn and they're out, they're free, they gave a united and a wonderful witness. But brethren, eventually, the poisoned tree of date setting reared its ugly head and brought forth the bitter fruit of animosity and division. And since the 1960s, we have been a body divided over calculations that never should have been made in the first place according to the words of Jesus himself. What does God have to do to get our attention? Do we have to be split up into 100 different groups, each with their own little sophisticated angle on these dates? Anyway, tomorrow we're going to continue this with yet another parable that Jesus gave to warn the brethren against calculating dates. It's the parable about that wise and faithful servant. Now, I do want to finish with a personal testimony. Last night, my dear brother George Pacius was supposed to pick me up at the airport. But I have a lifelong friend who lives in New Jersey. And his dear wife has had cancer for 3 years, in and out of remission. Over the past number of months, finally bedridden in his house as he took care of her, knowing she would pass away soon. I was going through that with him. I know that territory. With him every day through it in the ways that I could be. And she passed away a little over a week ago. And he knew I was coming out here. He wanted to pick me up at the airport. He wanted to talk. And I knew Brother George would be amenable to that. So my friend Danny picked me up and we went out to a place in Rutherford and talked quite a ways into the night about his trials, his tribulations, the loss of his wife. Now, he's of a Catholic persuasion. He thought when she died, she went to heaven. I wasn't going to disabuse him of that notion, of course. But I'm telling you, brethren, to know the truth, to be able to sit there and comfort him, help him through this, and know the truth about what's really going to happen with his wife, that they're going to be reunited. She's coming up in the resurrection along with everyone else. Even as I saw my friend suffer, to still know the truth and know what's going to happen eventually. What a comfort that was to me. And brethren, all that makes me think of is we're this tiny little minority in the whole world of mankind. God has blessed us with the most wonderful message on earth. How in the world, I just wonder, can we turn against each other for 1 millisecond over a date as to whether or not this or that happened and when. Brethren, for me, I hold on to the ransom for all and what that means for everyone. By all means, have your dates. Hold on to them, whatever's a blessing to you. But please, as you hold on to your dates, hold on to your brethren too, would you? May God add his blessing.